La musique, comme tous les modes d'expression, est souvent ciblée par des initiatives de contrôle du fond et de la forme du message, notamment des paroles. Après les attentats du 11 septembre 2001 aux États-Unis, un grand conglomérat médiatique, Clear Channel Communications, a conseillé aux stations de radio sous son contrôle de ne pas diffuser un certain nombre de chansons. D'autres incidents, certains plus préoccupants, ont eu lieu. Mon invité dans cet épisode, Martin Cloonan, a proposé une lecture de l'univers musical dans la période ayant suivi les attentats. Music, like all other modes of expression, is often targeted by censorious initiatives that aim at controlling its message, especially the lyrics. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks in the United States, a large media conglomerate, Clear Channel Communications, advised its radio stations not to air a number of songs. Other incidents, some of them more serious, also took place. My guest for this episode, Martin Cloonan, offers an analysis of the music world in the period that followed the attacks. So I'm thrilled to be here with Professor Martin Cloonan. Professor, welcome to the podcast. You are now a director of the Turku Institute for Advanced Studies in Finland, and you also hold a position at the School of Culture and Creative Arts at the University of Glasgow. Your research is focused on the political economy of the music industry, as well as censorship in music. And you are the author of several books, including Banned, Censorship of Popular Music in Britain from 1967 to 1992. This was published in 1996. And also another book, Popular Music in the United Kingdom, published in 2007. So I became familiar with your work when I had the idea to talk about corporate censorship of music for projects in my English class during my master's degree. In the wake of the September 11, 2001 attacks, some corporations chose not to air certain songs that were deemed likely to shock radio audiences. So this will be one of the main themes of our exchange. So my first question is about the idea that music could never be the same again. This was an idea that apparently got some traction after 9/11. It was found in the media, but also later in the writings of academic Murray Foreman. The idea that music could never be the same again after the terrorist attacks. So do you think time has disproved this entirely? And that in the long run there has been no real change to how music is made, sold, and listened to?
I'm not sure that Murray actually said that. I would be surprised if he did. He's far too sophisticated for that. However, to get back to your point, I do think it's true that music hasn't changed, at least not as a result of 9/11. I think that was an immediate knee-jerk reaction, which was both ahistorical and lacked a true understanding of the value of music to human beings.
Okay. So, and within a few days of the events, there was news that emerged that the large media conglomerate Clear Channel Communications, which is very powerful in radio broadcasting, had advised their radio stations against playing a certain number of songs. To that purpose, a memorandum was distributed to local stations with suggestions to avoid a list of well over 100 songs, actually. And some of the songs had titles that were deemed to be inappropriate in the circumstances, like Jet Airliner, Great Balls of Fire, Safe in New York City, Crash Into Me Baby, or It's the End of the World as We Know It. There were also songs like John Lennon's Imagine, which many radio listeners ended up requesting be played. And there were all songs by the band Rage Against the Machine that were also on the list. So can you comment on this list and this initiative by Clear Channel?
Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting, but for musicians on the ground, maybe not so important on a day-to-day basis. I think the power of corporations such as Facebook and Bandcamp and things like that are proved much more interesting and important in the contemporary era. You're talking about events of nearly 20 years ago now. The media landscape has changed unbelievably since then. So I'm not really sure how kind of cutting edge a 20-year-old Clear Channel list really is. However, I would say that more generally, broadcasters do feel that it's incumbent upon themselves to be extra sensitive at the time of such horrific events. And I think that you have to understand where the broadcasters are coming from. Basically, broadcasters want to retain audiences. They are very nervy about things which might not retain audiences. Now, they may have been oversensitive, and you can always find the odd stupid example of things. But I think you have to put yourself in the shoes of the broadcasters at that time. Otherwise, you risk being ahistorical and kind of looking back and laughing when actually they might have to make some quite difficult decisions. All this is not necessarily to defend Clear Channel's actions, which were themselves rather knee-jerk and perhaps lacked a sophisticated understanding of audiences. However, it is to say that, censorship is a very tricky issue, and you need to understand not only the text, but more particularly the context.
Okay. So, and it's also the case that the band Rage Against the Machine had their website shut down after a complaint by the Secret Services. Yeah. So anyway, in the longer run, you argue that musical responses to 9/11 can broadly be classified in three categories. The first one you call the conservative patriotic. Then there was what one could call the progressive patriotic. And then there was the radical one.
Yeah.
Most musicians, according to you, articulated a defense of America, but the point of disagreement was on exactly what America is.
Yep.
And you argue that it's an idea open to contestation. Maybe you can elaborate on this point.
Yeah, I wouldn't say most musicians, because most musicians didn't do anything. I would say most musicians who commented probably tended to defend an idea of America. But Benedict Anderson has, of course, the classic work on this, in which he describes nations as imagined communities, and because nations only really exist in our head. There was no point, I'm here in Finland, and there was no point in time where all the Finnish people, whatever that might mean, get together as a community. So the notion of a Finnish people or an American people or Italian or whatever exists in our head. So that means we have to imagine them. And the ways in which we imagine them can be various. We can imagine them as being politically progressive. We can imagine them as particular skin pigmentations or whatever. But the notion of any nation is contested. It's particularly so, I think, in the case of the United States, which has been seen as both the kind of the hallmark of all kind of progressive freedom, but while at the same time also being seen in some circles as having particularly in foreign affairs, policies which have endangered the world and so on. So these notions will. One only has to look at the United States now and the incumbent presidency to see how notions of America are played out. And it's not surprising that they're played out in the country's most popular art form and the world's most popular art form, popular music. Where better to contest these notions? Anything from the kind of more reactionary elements up to the more kind of progressive stuff of Springsteen, and even the radical stuff, Marxist stuff like bands like the Coup.
So maybe we can give a few more details about each one of the family of responses, if you will. So what you call the conservative patriotic response, one could characterize it as, I guess, as nationalistic, and it expressed what seems to be an unconditional loyalty to the government's actions in the wake of 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always you've got to realise what a powerful event 9/11 was. This was unprecedented, and it was a truly shocking and outrageous, event which killed thousands of people. It was an absolutely disgusting event. The reaction for that is obviously going to be played out politically. But also, always in politics, you have to distinguish, I think, between the nation state that you're trying to defend and the present government, which is not necessarily the same thing. I think that unfortunately, in times of crisis, these tend to get run together. It's very hard to oppose the president of any country at a time when your country is at war. So, especially in the days immediately after, and especially as the country's going into conflict, it's very easy to confuse the government of the day with the bigger nation state.
So, however, in your estimation, this nationalistic response in the music industry was rather limited in scope and number, correct?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, it's hard to tell. I mean, one of the things, of course, that one gets with these sorts of things is a kind of media account of all these events and kind of lines and so on. One would have to do a lot more kind of nuanced work to look at, what radio stations are playing, what records were being released, what gigs were being played, etc., to get a more holistic picture. But I guess, there were some artists expressing what, in retrospect, might be seen as rather reactionary views. I mean, Toby Keith's the kind of classic example of that. Someone who describes himself as a Democrat, but was probably at the front of the kind of flag waving at that point.
Mm-hmm. So also rather limited in scope and number was what you call the radical response. So one could call it revolutionary, or maybe, I don't know, Marxist, depending on the details of which band one looks at, I guess. And this family of responses was probably even more anecdotal than the nationalist one.
Well, somebody described me as socialists in America being a bit like snakes in Ireland. Not very many of them. However, there is a radical leftist tradition in the United States, and unsurprisingly, that responded to the events of 9/11 as well. Musically, it's found the coup who got the most kind of headlines for that. I mean, I think what might be more interesting was the fact that rap, which has been seen as probably the most radical of popular music art forms, was fairly muted around 9/11 and was quite often kind of supported the government of the day on the grounds that it was almost like the hood had been attacked and we need to defend ourselves. So there's kind of minority voices always, but again, I think that mainstream popular music, not much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think you have to be careful about terms like mainstream popular music. However, I'll correct myself there, because I think that something like country music is always mainstream music in the United States.
Very well. So, and finally, one can talk about the most common response, probably by far, if I read you correctly, which is what you call the liberal patriotism, or one could call it progressive patriotism. So certainly here there was some attachment to civil liberalism and free expression that surfaced. And if please go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think if obviously the biggest artist there would be someone like Springsteen, with his album The Rising and so on. And Springsteen is a genuine attempt, I think, to kind of understand the enemy, but that doesn't go down very well at a time of war in some circles. And then the other kind of more, I guess, leftist example would be someone like Steve Earle, who was, writing songs trying to understand terrorism in a big way. And the reaction against Steve Earle. But Steve Earle would see himself as a patriot. If you look at the album around that time, Jerusalem, it has acknowledgements of the great American tradition. So of a kind of radicalism and the idea that America belongs to the people and not the corporations. So I think that these ideas of America, as I said earlier on, were played out again and again in popular music. Unfortunately, I think kind of media accounts and large conglomerates within the media are not very empathetic to kind of nuanced accounts at times of war.
Okay, so I briefly mentioned the exception of Rage Against the Machine, which had its website monitored and even shut down at some point by the Secret Service. Okay, but if you set that exception aside, which is certainly an important exception, the censorship of music that took place after 9/11 was of a corporate nature rather than governmental, and hence not in violation of the First Amendment. So what are your thoughts on this distinction? And this probably, is a very, I guess, very important question these days, because, as you mentioned before, nowadays one can think about Twitter and Facebook, for instance. And although they are not governmental, they certainly are platforms on which many people express themselves. So when they shut down someone, certainly it is not the government doing it, but still they hold a lot of power. So what do you think of this distinction?
Well, I thought for a long time that as the power of governments declines and the power of a corporation increases. So, I mean, if you look historically, the way that censorship has worked is, I guess, in the kind of modern era, probably the first great censors are religious authorities, and they still have a great interest in that. So traditionally, I think in the West, it's things like the Catholic Church, banning books and so on. And then once you get into the modern era, It's the nation state which has the power to do this. The nation state now has less control over communications than it once did, and now the power. So it's kind of moved from the public space into the private space, the space of corporations and so on. And the problem with corporations, of course, is that it's harder to bring corporations to account than it is to bring governments to account. It's pretty bloody hard to bring governments to account. So I guess in the longer term, you need to move away, perhaps, from thinking about censorship as something that's just done to people, and think about actually access to the airways and access to the internet and who controls that. It's the power to get your voice heard, which is on a day-to-day basis, I think, which is much more important in the longer term than isolated incidents of censorship. It's actually who's in control on a day-to-day basis, not simply at times of crisis.
So in this case, I guess that you would be very concerned about the recent developments around net neutrality.
Yeah, I'd be more concerned about Facebook than I would about some governments.
Okay, very well. Another question about the musical response to 9/11, which is about this compilation album named God Bless America, which was released by Columbia Records to raise money for 9/11 related charities. So here you wrote, and I will quote, so the album includes protest music from Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson, which were now removed from their original context and used in a project to reunite the nation. Here, forms of music which had been used to critique the status quo were utilized in order to try and rebuild the same status quo. End of the quote. So do you see this as purely a form of corporate cynicism, or as a sign that America is able to absorb and take account of valid criticism of it, or of something else altogether, maybe?
I wouldn't necessarily see it as an either or. It could be both. I'm not sure that I would necessarily see that as cynical. It may have been well motivated. I don't know. But again, you have to kind of put yourself in the context of what was a truly outrageous and terrible event. I would have thought that most people at that time would want to be saying, we're on the side of America, and if you're an American record company, how do you do that? Well, you put American music and you try and promote that and say we'll use the profits to help the victims. Now you can be very cynical about kind of charity things and things like that, but I did think it was interesting that there was protest music was then being shown to be an American kind of thing at exactly the same time when protest was being stamped down on in some circles. So there was a kind of paradox, I guess, around all that. But it was, Dylan and Mahalia Jackson and people like that were fairly kind of staunch critics in the 50s and 60s, and now their music's being used to reunite the nation. So there's I don't know whether it's a paradox or irony or both.
So would you say that the corporate censorship sprang from the line of thought according to which those who doubted the wisdom of George Bush's foreign policy were deemed to be essentially on the side of the terrorists?
I think you'd have to give me some examples of corporate censorship other than the channel, Clear Channel list. I think the Clear.
Yeah. I was talking about this one. Yeah.
Well, I think the Clear Channel list was probably an attempt to not to offend more than to clamp down on dissident voices.
Yeah, you're right. Okay. Would you say that there have been events in the meantime, I mean, between 2001 and now, that have, caused such a strong reaction around music? So including these corporate attempts to suppress the airing of music, or haven't we seen the likes of 9/11 at this point?
9/11 is a unique event in human history, as far as I know.
In terms of its, repercussions in the music world.
I'm struggling to think of another example, particularly if you look at the American music industries. I can't think of one off the top of my head that's had quite the same impact. I guess, no, I can't think of one. But I think as I said earlier, what I think is more interesting is how the media landscape has changed since then. I mean, with 9/11, the internet is nowhere near as important as it is now. And we still have things like record companies. Well, record companies are nowhere near as powerful as, if you look at Sony and CBS, they're nowhere near as powerful as they were before. And it's probably people who are controlling access to the internet. And also the other side of all this is, it's not only getting new voice on. I mean, I can put up a track now on the internet.
Yeah.
It's the promotional activity work that you need to get your voice heard, which I think is much more important today. Always was important, but it's but there was a way through doing it through record companies before. As they become less powerful and the internet corporations have become more powerful, then the balance of power has changed within the media industries. That's where I think you need to dig more.
Okay, so I know that your time is counted. I will therefore skip to my last question. So you also chair the Free Muse project, which advocates and defends artistic freedom worldwide. So could you briefly present the activities of the Free Muse project?
Well, tomorrow it's going to launch its report on artistic freedom across the world. So have a look at that tomorrow. Look at there's some stuff on the Free Muse website already. Free Muse is an organisation set up around about 20 years ago by some Danish activists, Marie Korpe and Ole Reithoff. And for 20 years, we've been monitoring the censorship of music across the world, trying to campaign for oppressed musicians. And most of Free Muse's work has not been in the kind of glitzy American kind of media world, but in the much harsher world of the developing world, places where governments probably still have more power than we would sometimes like them to. So, and political dissent is even less tolerated than it is sometimes in the West. So, Free Muse, I think, is a remarkable organisation which has been involved in getting people out of jail and has really tried to uphold the rights of musicians as articulated in various international documents. So, for example, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so we try to look at those and insofar as they apply to musicians and defend those rights. So basically monitoring and defending and campaigning, bringing these sorts of things to people's attention. I mean, music censorship is fairly low down on the political agenda. When you've got starvation and poverty to deal with and so on. But it's, if you want a fully rounded society, you've got to have freedom of musical expression. So Free Muse has tried to guarantee that.
So on the basis of your participation in this group, would you be able to say whether the worldwide level of free musical expression, I guess, has been going rather up or rather down in the last 20 years?
Well, you have to have a look at the report tomorrow. I think it's suggesting that it's going down. That things are getting worse.
Okay, well, that's very bad news, but certainly I will have a look at it.
Yeah, do.
So is there something that you would like to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're really interested in censorship, don't look beyond the headlines. Don't look at the kind of Clear Channel and all those kind of lists. They're fairly boring, actually. Look at what actually happens to musicians on the ground on a day-to-day basis. It's much more interesting. Don't look at the top, look at the bottom.
Okay, very well. Well, thanks again for agreeing to talk to us. All the best to you and to Free Muse.
Thanks a lot. Have a look tomorrow.
Yeah, I will.
Take care.
See you. Thanks again.